A price cap on rice, abductions of environmental activists, abuse of the privilege of confidential funds, EJKs. There's a lot going on. But there's also much going on beneath the surface. There's an undercurrent of history being acknowledged or challenged or denied. It's been 50 years after martial law, 40 years after the Aquino assassination, and next year it will be the 35th anniversary of the death of the dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Two new books raise a consequential question. In the struggle of memory against forgetting, what and how and why should we remember? Good evening. I'm John Nery, and you are in the public square. I'm happy to say that the editors of those books join us tonight. Mercado, Alcantara and Mookie, Katigbak-Lacuesta are two of the three general editors of A Death Foretold, the Ninoy Aquino Assassination Remembered, which was launched a week ago. And Joanne Q. Maglipon is the editor of Serve, a sequel in a way to Not on Our Watch, that book with the unflinching, unforgettable subtitle, Martial Law Really Happened, We Were There. Serve will be launched this weekend. Thank you, Anne, Mookie, and Joanne for joining us in the public square. My first question is for Joanne, who is, of course, one of the country's finest editors. I wanted this to be a conversation about memory. What do both Not on Our Watch, which came out in 2012, and Serve, which comes out in 2023, teach us about remembering?
I really don't know how we can have any kind of unity or any moving forward without the truth on our side. And it seems to me that I can hardly recognize the kind of country that is being described on social media. So, more than ever, we need to remember. And I find that one book is just one too little for the kind of remembering that we need to do. That's why I almost have to apologize that it took us so long to come out with this book. Here it is. It's
Wow.
It's being launched. Yeah, it's being launched this week, September 9. That's right. But I wish we could have done more. We could have done a lot.
We'll get back to that, and again, worry the question of remembering. A question for Anne. For the Ninoy Aquino book, you chose the oral history form again, the same one used in the famous Reuter Mercado People Power book. Full disclosure, I was also a member of that editorial team. Why that form? Was it always that from the start of the project, oral history?
Yes, it was always like that from the start of the project. And you're right in pointing out that the People Power book was actually a model for us, a template for us from the very beginning. For the People Power book, which we did 37 years back, the oral history really worked because we were struggling to come out right away within 3 months of the revolution. So, what worked most at that time was uh, oral history. Here, in contrast, we're looking back at 40 years. So, ironically, we also felt that an oral history would do better in the recalling and in the remembering.
Again, we'll have time later to go back and talk about this particular form and other possible forms you could have considered. My first question for Mookie, I really found the introduction to A Death Foretold fascinating because it poses what I think are fundamental philosophical questions. One of the questions you raise is, how safe are historical events at this moment in history? I mean, maybe later I can ask you what even brought you to that moment to ask that question. But was that the organizing principle for the book?
Yes, it was.
How safe are historical events?
Well, yes, it was, John. And it was an editorial decision actually to frame it that way. So we had a really great board of editors helping us out, people from journalists to, literary writers. We really thought long and hard about how to frame the book, and I guess we arrived at that question really because we wanted to address how to preserve our own human experiences and how human experience actually speaks its own truth, especially during these times. And by allowing people to speak about their experiences, you actually empower them and, make them truth tellers, in an age where it's so variable and easy to change.
Can we spend some time on this? I'd like to ask all three of you, what is the value of an event today? Something happening, something real, in an age of disruption and disinformation.
Well, I guess, John, you give us all a voice. You give the public a voice. It's like, when people gathered. I think I was 3 years old when Ninoy Aquino was assassinated. So I came across the materials, really, really fresh, and I really saw, an event that galvanized an entire nation and brought everybody together. And it was a truth. The truth of the events, the truth of how it affected us, was something that affected millions of people. And if those millions of people, a fraction of which were allowed to speak their own truths in this book, felt empowered to tell their stories, then that's really something. That's truth telling on a different level, on a level that empowers not just one person, that emboldens actually many people to come together.
John?
Um, you know, um, it's very difficult for me to just zero in on what's happening now. Our group, our generation of writers, we were campus editors from the years 69 to 72.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we've been through a great deal of events. Um, Martial law, we had to go underground, many of us.
Mm-hmm.
Many of us disrupted their schooling. Many of us, some of us went to the hills, some of us died. And some of us were tortured, stayed in prison anywhere from 1 year to, well, to 10. So from there were other events. Um, the killing of Ninoy. Um, and then his widow coming to run the country. All these events, it's like a runaway train. It's
Mm-hmm.
almost difficult to pin down. So all these efforts are good because without the books of Anne and everyone else, you don't stop the events and take a good look. One event will just follow the next event up to the next event. It gets overwhelming, and after a while, you just shut down because you want to just live in the present and not mess with your head. So I think every single effort helps just to pause, to make everyone pause and think.
Thank you. Anne?
Just a couple of things, no? Something that a lot of people say now, or I hear a lot now, is people say it doesn't happen until you take a picture. I'm in this world of selfies right now.
Mhm.
So I think to stop, as Joanne said, to pause and take a picture of what does it look like now, or what do those formative years, I call those 1983 onward, our formative years for those of us who were on campus a little later than Joanne,
Mhm.
but also very much formed by those years. It's important to stop, take a picture, look at ourselves again, and see how we have a unique perspective now to see how much has changed or those events have changed us. Second thing that's important to me is a personal story where I run a little B&B and I was working with my staff. I'm a small entrepreneur. And one of my staff members one day said, alam ko na ma'am, hindi pala talaga totoo yung pagkapatay kay Ninoy. And this was somebody who works very closely with me. And it
Mhm.
really hurt. Sabi niya, napanood ko sa YouTube, imbento lang daw lahat yan. And all I could say was, paano yun? Kasi nandun naman ako, totoo naman yun, narinig ko, may mga kaibigan akong inaresto. So I think that is something that was driving me to make sure that these stories are told, captured, and retold.
That's certainly part of the context, right, Mookie? In the
Yes.
introduction, when you talk about how safe are historical events, that's part of the context, right? It's not just human frailty,
Yeah.
tendency to forget, but there is an organized effort to make
Right.
us forget, to
Yeah.
obscure
Yeah.
things.
That's right.
The events actually, or the truth of what happened 40 years ago. There
Mhm.
seems to be a concerted effort to wipe out our collective memory. And I think and I hope that this book actually works to preserve and is successful in preserving such a definitive event in our history.
Can we talk a bit about the sources of this information? Um, Back during the first quarter storm, Joanne, I mean, I'm sure, of course, there were organized lies already, no? But I think the scale of disinformation efforts today are just staggering, right? So on top of human frailty, on top of what you just said, no, the overwhelming nature of everyday history, one event follows another, right? We have to contend with uh, disinformation. You talked earlier about social media. Um, is the reality on social media, well, it's different from what we know, but is it real? Is it make believe? What are we dealing with here?
The scary thing with social media is that it can win a presidency. So we have to take it seriously. And the formats that it has birthed, uh, from TikTok to many other forms, um, very, very casual, very playful. Um, we have to learn how to master these forms as well. So there is a place for books, but there is a place for all the forms out there that we have to seize. We have to take the platforms around us seriously.
That's right. I mean, looking at the editors' profiles of the three general editors who edited A Death Foretold, I see that my good friend Anne, who's been a book editor, print writer for so long, has added a new line to her CV, which is vlogger.
Yes. Yes.
I was a little, yeah, I mean, okay, I understand, but at the same time, I was also a little surprised. Yeah, that's right. I mean, we need to do these, to go into these new forms as well. Joanne, you've been quoted as saying that Serve is not, in fact, a book about old persons talking about old times, reminiscing about old times.
You know why that came from this? When one of
Mhm,
my friends was selling the book, pre-selling,
mhm,
she found out that 35-year-olds and below, who had the money because they were working,
mhm.
they were not buying. And these were woke people.
Okay.
Why weren't they buying? I just surmise it must be because you don't want to listen to old people talking about their old adventures. So I had to make a point of saying, no, this is not a vanity publication. This is
Mhm,
not about self-aggrandizement, or this is not about
mhm,
making ourselves illustrious. And in fact, I told you I was writing a speech for the launch
mhm,
night.
mhm,
That's exactly what the content is. I'm trying to say what the book is not, because you don't realize how many ideas are out there that
mhm,
astound you for the sheer uh, incorrectness,
Yes.
mhm.
for the sheer craziness. So I think you have to keep addressing everything. We cannot be dismissive.
Can we talk about your contributors? I mean, you have more
Yeah.
contributors now in the second anthology,
Oh,
90,
yeah, yeah.
some
This
of them
is
very
way.
distinguished.
this is way superior to the first, because
Mhm.
this time, you know, the first one, not on our watch,
Mhm.
I just allowed people who had the time to submit, and
Okay.
I wasn't very picky. I wasn't a nag.
Mhm.
But now the OC in me came out with this book. Really, back and forth, drafts, four drafts, etc., etc. And I was dealing with PhDs and magna cums and valedictorians. Me, who got a D in math in high school and college, and was dropped to section two. So, but they were so wonderful. I think the more accomplished you are, I think the more wonderful you become, because I had the easiest time with, for instance, Ray Vea,
Mhm.
Manolete Dairit,
Mhm.
Ed Gonzalez. These people were just fabulous. Sunny Coloma.
Mhm.
So here they are. And the good thing is, they brought their narrative to wherever they wanted to bring it. So no one was stuck in the martial law years. In
Okay.
fact, most moved from there and got into how this affected their lives in the next intermediate years and then beyond to the present. It's so nice. Some of them turned out to be evangelists,
Mhm.
pastors, businessmen, presidents of universities, etc. They went every which way, bringing their beliefs with them, although
Mhm.
the beliefs had evolved. So this is really good. It was an eye opener for me because I had not followed these friends for the longest time. We were
Mhm.
all living our lives separately, but when I read their stories, you know, I have to admit, this is supposed to be a cerebral book, and it is. But I was crying with every chapter I was editing.
Mm.
Don't ask me why; it's too convoluted to explain. But
Mhm.
I just kept crying, and then I just remembered that Ray Vea, who just stepped down as Mapua University president, and is now the head of the schools, a merger of the Yuchenko group and the Ayala group. Um, he also talked about how, in hindsight, those activist years were the best years of his life. And yet, he can go on to say, but those times are over. The days of whining, the days of
Mhm.
decrying are way over. Now it's time to act with my limited resources, with my limited powers. We need to give solutions. That's where we are at now.
Um, let's get back to that point later, no, about pathways forward. I want to ask Anne and Mookie. You have 150 contributors. I'm not going to ask you to name every single one. How did you choose them? Can you give us a profile of who these people are and how they were chosen, why they were chosen? Maybe Anne
Uh,
first, and then Mookie. Mhm.
Sorry, go ahead, Anne. Yes, please.
Um, First of all, there was a decision to try to find people who ordinary man on the street people, as well
Mhm.
as people who were close to the event. So we
Mhm.
tried as much as possible to get. So when we event, we're talking about August 21. So and maybe different from Joanne's book, where she focused, she allowed them to go wherever they wanted to go. We focused on just August 21. Where were you? What were you doing? What did you feel? Did it have an impact on you or not? And and so on that basis, we chose people who were at the airport, but we also chose people who were far away, maybe
Mhm.
in the mountains, in other countries, etc., so that we could feel, instead of smaller and smaller circles, we tried to create wider and wider circles to get this story. So that was one, and then we tapped into our own social networks, our own friends. But at the same time, we tried to reach out as far as we could to people that we didn't know to get their
Mhm.
story too. And then people, after a while, after we had started the momentum going, people were asking us to be included in the book.
Can I ask a question? Um,
Yes, ma'am.
how did I'm very curious because it's so difficult to do a book with so many
Yes,
people. Um,
yes.
how did you do your editorial work? How was it?
I love this question, Joanne. There's a great contrast because we worked on People Power book before, which also had a lot of contributors, and we did it in the 80s. We did it by literally we had type printouts, and we put them in boxes. This is for day 1 of February 25. This is for day 2, this day 3, day 4. We could not do this time anymore for two reasons. One is we had so many more contributors and we were covering 40 years. And also because we're doing remote work. So we were hardly ever together in the same room. We can maybe count with a few fingers the number of times. So, Joanne, we used a software called Delve. It's a data qualitative analysis, which allowed us to code the narratives. And after coding the narratives, it would help us easily weave the commonalities, the contrasts um, together so that we can form a narrative. So, really, the software available to us now is awesome. So
But
that's
That,
how
how
that's a
we
much?
did the editorial work.
that's
But
a
but
new line to your CV, coder.
Yeah, yes, yes.
but how much editorial intervention was there in the final output?
I think that a lot of there were intersections between the accounts. They common phrases kept popping up. For instance, people would mention the airport, or people would mention the days that followed. Let's say the funeral itself, or Santo Domingo Church. So depending on these keywords that popped up, we knew where to put certain accounts, and we traced basically the narrative of events. There's actually a timeline on the bottom
Mhm.
of the book. You'll see it. So it traces Ninoy's days from being a politico to being a prisoner to being an exile to coming back. So even that timeline defined the narrative of the book. So we tried to be, there was a chronological timeline. At the same time, there was also a narrative timeline.
Wow.
So yeah, with this new software that popped up, as well as the guidance of history, actually, these were framing devices in and of themselves. So I would say, Anne, I don't know, I think you will agree that the editorial work was actually easy already after the setting of those narrative frameworks.
But
It
but
was arriving at the narrative frameworks that were harder. But just to go directly to Joanne's question about how much editorial intervention did we do, the other general editor is Sarge Lacuesta, and he would often repeat to us that I want the editors to be as invisible as possible and just allow. So we do have narrative context inputs, but
Yes.
very minimal. And we really decided on a very cold voice, distant
Yeah.
voice to frame all the testimonials.
I'll add to
well,
that and say it was
mhm.
also guided by Anne, who said, really, it's the accounts that are the bida.
Yeah.
Nothing else. You listen to the accounts. You don't really mess with the accounts. They will speak for themselves.
One of the features that I really liked is the guide to reading. They have a page where they annotate a sample page, and will tell you this is the narrative context. This is the description of the person speaking at that particular time in 1983, and then this part is where is a short description of him today or her today, and then there's the timeline and so on. So it helps. It reminds me of those terrific Dorling Kindersley books. Like there is no excuse for you to get lost in the book. But
You hit
Mookie,
it on the head, John. That's precisely our model, the DK books.
DK books,
It's
right?
another model for going into this reading experience.
Mookie, I was struck by what you said earlier, that you were 3 years old when the
I
assassination
was.
happened. Yeah.
Yes,
So
I was. So,
how can you tell us a little about your process of discovering Ninoy Aquino?
it was
Was it
funny,
through
John,
this book
because
or?
yeah, it was through research for this book actually. So we would go to the archives of the Aquino Center in Tarlac.
Mhm.
And as all these things were coming along, I was encountering the material for the first time and feeling, and Anne knows this, super invested. So I would bring information to the table that everybody knew already pala. And I'd be coming as if, wow, I discovered this. Wow, I solved the murder mystery. And of course I hadn't. Everybody had known all these things decades before I had. So I'd like to think that people from my generation and the next generations after, because there are
Mhm.
legitimately two generations already after me encountering history and being more vocal, certainly, than my generation, and being more woke on social media. I shouldn't do that. Being woke
Without the air.
without the marks, they are just woke. I hope that they encounter this material with the same enthusiasm and freshness that I did. I mean, it was so real to me. I was so alive to the material, and I thank this book for that. I thank our publisher Risa Oreta, who's an Aquino. Her mother was the late Senator Tessie Oreta. She just gave us
Yeah.
just trusted us with this, just trusted us to sort out the narrative, just trusted us to explore the material that we were given, and opened so many doors by virtue of who she was. So that trust really propelled us. That seldom happens with a publisher and a group of core editors. So we
Thank
had
John,
so
if
you.
much
I
freedom to explore.
Yes.
Yeah.
John, if I may add something to
Sure.
Mookie's narration. First of all, Mookie was our inspiration. She was
Whoa.
the pace setter because she was discovering these things for the first time. So number one, it reminded us of our primary audience, which is this generation. So to figure out how to present this information which we felt was old to this new generation. So Mookie was our inspiration. She was always coming to us, hey, I found this, hey, I found that. Second, what Mookie said about our publisher, Risa Oreta, she made sure, she said, um, tell people who Uncle Ninoy was.
Yeah.
Even, don't make him a saint, don't make
Yeah.
him more than a martyr that he is. Whatever his political life was, whatever people say about that, let it come out, let it come out. So,
Yeah.
so there, from our publisher, there was no editing to make him seem larger than who he was. So, which again, we appreciated that trust.
Thank you.
I'd like to say,
Mhm.
I just want to say about publishers. Do you know that we had to audition to
Oh.
be published? Yeah, I had to bring the first drafts of the manuscripts to Ateneo, leave it there
Mm.
for their editors to decide whether they would publish or not, was kept in the dark for a couple of weeks. Uh, if I knew how to do the novena still, I would, except that I think I'd forgotten, despite my Maryknoll education. We waited until finally they said, yeah, we will consider publishing this. Nag-audition pa kami, ha? Nag-audition ka.
John, you said earlier that event following event
Mm.
can be overwhelming, especially for someone like you who's been a journalist for decades.
Actually, since actually since 72, because before martial law came down,
Mhm.
I had been working for um, um, Now Magazine
Mhm.
for several months until martial law came down, and then interrupted by prison and underground life, but then resumed again. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
All right. Interrupted
Matagal.
by prison, as things are.
Yeah.
But John, my question has to do with the sense of discovery. I mean, you knew the material down pat, but did you have Mookie's sense of discovery also when you
Oh,
were going through
oh yes.
the
Oh
pieces?
yes. Yes, yes, yes. I thought I knew these people, and maybe I had a monolithic sense of how we all were going with the national democratic cause. But it
Mhm.
turned out I was really stunned by the insights, by the self examination, by both regret and triumph of these people, of these 19 authors, each one had a different story to tell. Some were forced into exile. How did they cope? It could have broken them, but they became, well, Chito Santa Romana and
Mhm.
Jimmy Flor Cruz.
Jimmy.
They became the heads of the broadcast networks, American broadcast networks that they belonged to in Beijing. Um, each one, each one faced adversarial conditions that lesser lesser hearts would have folded under. So the discovery was tremendous. For instance, I did not know that some of them were sentimental, but most of them trying to hide it, trying to act nonchalant about the tears and the emotions. Everyone was being cerebral because they have been in fields that require them to be cerebral. I mean, most of them have PhDs. So um, when you discover these things, both the language, the tone, the content, the insight, um, the development of self, I'm very proud to be part of this group. I never got the chance, by the way, to write my own chapter. I ran out of time because I took the job seriously only starting January of this year. Before that, it was come and go. People come with bring in stuff, pictures and stuff. The admin work was tremendous, and there was no team to speak of because
Mhm.
being very busy, titled people, no one was free. So I was the only one who made time. At one point, I wanted to say, akala nyo ba, wala akong ginagawa sa buhay ko? Hindi nyo ba alam na full time ako? Hindi nyo ba alam na masesesante nga ako kasi nahuli ako? You know, the COO caught me in the office photoshopping with the artist of the office a photograph that was to be used on the cover of the book. Ye gods! And then he sat down, and then he's a cousin. He's a Gokongwei, and then he said, "Oh, John, what is that? Who are those? I recognize that. He's a very friendly sort." And then who? So I plunged into it, and I told him about it, and then he got so interested. And then he said, "You must tell me when the book is done." Buti na lang, wala siyang sinabi. And then si Liza Gokongwei, um, nahuli din niya ako several times kasi kakausapin niya ako. And then my mind was elsewhere. So I go, yes, I'm sorry. And then I finally focus. And then to top it all, binentahan ko pa ng libro. So, sabi ko naman more than one. Ginagamit ko na nga yung oras ng opisina niya. Binentahan ko pa, wala akong libre na ibibigay sa kanya. Wala kaming libre, no? Ang mahigpit ng Ateneo, no?
Well, that's again another line to the CV, no? Advertising sales executive. But John, I read that the book is also about pathways forward, right? And maybe that's explained by the title "Serve." Why the title?
Oh, we could, there were so many attempts at so many titles until finally, but the thing that kept coming up in all the chapters was serve the people. That was the mantra of the 70s and the 80s. So
Mhm.
serve the people. And I go, I talk to the artist and I go, uh, not how do we capture this? How do we capture this line without making it sound like a cliche? And then we came up with this. So serve just goes down the vertical line, and
Mhm.
then all of these the people, the economy, government, children, environment, press freedom, academe, a supreme being, women, the country, we all put it here. And then someone came up with these lines. They were fearless college editors from 1969 to 1972. Martial law profoundly changed the course of their lives. Here are their stories. Then I said, sige, let's not do more than that. Kasi, hindi ba when you say too much, parang nakakaumay. And then parang stop it, just leave it. You think they're not smart enough to get it? Leave it alone. So we left it alone. And the reason it is black, I'm so sorry, it's not more attractive. I would have wanted a Frida Kahlo cover type cover. It's because we wanted the pictures of iconic martial law artworks
Oh,
like this to
wow.
be in full color.
Wow.
So
Wow.
there's a folio in the middle. Ben Cab has his brown brother, Adiba and
Amazing.
Santos. So we
Wow.
wanted this in color so that here Ben Cab on this Ben Cab, and
Wow.
I think this is Antipas Antipas de Lotaro with this one.
If-
We spent the money on
Yeah,
the colored folio
yeah.
of iconic martial law artworks.
It's amazing.
But boring ba? Boring ba the black?
You
Okay,
No,
tell me
no,
the truth.
we'll buy more than one copy. We promise.
Kasi my daughter said Nanay, why naman black? Ay, I couldn't say, wala kaming pera.
Anne and Mookie, when I first heard of the book project, I thought it was just specifically on the day itself, no, August 21. But looking at your table of contents, you actually contextualize that particular day. You talk about Nino as the prisoner, the exile, the aftershock, the aftermath, and so on. Can you walk us through the editorial process where you decided it would be like this, divided into these chapters?
Uh, Mookie, shall I?
go, go, go. Yes.
First of all, even if we decided that we were going to ask only these four questions,
Mhm.
people couldn't contain themselves. They would stretch back to if they knew Ninoy way before he was assassinated. They would talk about him before, and we realized how important that was because many people were skeptical about him and only and experienced a conversion upon knowing him more after the assassination. And also, many people couldn't help it but look back and reflect on how they had been changed. So I think it's accurate to say that we didn't set out to do the 10 chapters that we eventually ended up with, but
Mhm.
we saw such a treasure trove in the prior context as well as on the insights on how his assassination had transformed their lives. One of our other editor, Krip Yuson, I
Mhm.
like the way he said it that after reading all the testimonials, what we saw was a transformation, a change in people's relationships to Ninoy.
Yeah.
Being maybe skeptical at first or not trusting at all to this death and then seeing the impact on their lives. There was a shift in that relationship. So I guess that's how also the chapters were eventually organized.
Yeah, I think it's also a reaction to how the Marcos government at the time controlled the press. Uh, Part of the reason Nino Aquino went home, I think, according to Soc Rodrigo, according to his son, Attorney King Rodrigo, was that he was being forgotten
Yeah.
and he needed to come back. The other reason was there was a need for a leader of the what Soc Rodrigo called the Democratic Center. But being forgotten, that was deliberate also on the part of the Marcoses. When I remember reading in the newspapers, in the crony newspapers at the time, when there was talk of him coming back, the Daily Express, the Times Journal, the Bulletin Today would come out with old stories of Ninoy, reprinted from the New York Times when he was, a young politician on the make, talking about, going around town surrounded by bodyguards, riding helicopter, creating this image of somebody remote. There was also a famous columnist or infamous columnist at the time. He was the primary critic of Marcos before martial law, then became the primary supporter, Doroy Valencia. And he created this term called state commandos to refer to people like Raul Manglapus who had to flee to the United States. And so when Nino Aquino was in the States, that label was also attempted on him. So I think that's part of the context why when that happened, and people started asking questions. I remember listening to his speeches for the first time on cassette tapes
Yes.
in street corners during rallies. And my
Yes.
God, he was such a mesmerizing speaker. I had no idea. I was too young when he was, running for senator. So I think that was part of the context also, and I'm glad that's captured, that's reflected in the testimonies that you were able to gather. Mookie, I have a question. If you
Yeah.
had more time or more resources, what would you have wanted to do to flesh out this portrait of Ninoy Aquino?
Actually, no, John, I am so satisfied with the range of the scope of the book. It just covered for me such a full story already. I mean, we had intended to, as Anne mentioned, we had intended to stick to just August 21.
Mhm.
But this spurred an entire movement. So we had to move beyond that. And we talked about this as being like the precursor to the People Power book, actually, but working like the Star Wars trilogy.
Yeah.
Were made
Right.
with better technology, but which were the precursors to the original stories. So we see the connection. We see the very clear connection between the events that transpired in August 21 and people power. That's what we believe led to actually people power. I am so happy with the scope. We started with building up Ninoy as an opposition leader, trying to really tell the story of why his death mattered. I mean, you were right. Maybe he was becoming obscure already. He was in the States for 3 years and really wanted to make a comeback. But based on the stories, he made a comeback because he was worried about the country. He said it himself. He was trying to come home, to speak with the president, come up with solutions to what he thought was plaguing the country, um, while he was far away. So I'm happy with the scope. It covers his early years, his birth, up to the aftermath of his death. Actually ends with the snap election. In the timeline, we end with the snap election. So that's quite a range. So you
Yeah,
really
that's
see,
about that's
yeah,
about 1,000 days. I keep saying that.
Yes.
That's about
yeah,
1,000 days between August 21, 1983, and February 25, 1986. You also end with his statement, his arrival statement.
yes, yes,
Uh,
we do.
in, you know what I'd like to know? Who who wrote that? Did he write that himself? Did Doy Laurel help him write that in Taipei? I mean, it's very well written. It's obviously influenced by his time in Harvard.
Yeah.
Um, it's also very powerful. So that's a mystery for me. I'd like to know who wrote that arrival statement.
I think it's in keeping with the tone of his other speeches. I think it sounds very much like the speeches he wrote
That's
while
right.
he was
Mhm.
in
Yeah.
Fort Santiago. That the tone is very consistent, actually. So I'd like to believe he wrote them.
No, I'm sure that he had a hand in it. I'm sure he
Yeah, yeah,
wrote
yeah.
part of
Absolutely,
it.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But I
Maybe.
guess just based on what's out there, on the material that's out there, it sounds consistent with his previous speeches. To me,
Mhm.
at least.
Maybe one last question for everyone. We're running long. I was struck, and of course, I find it illuminating to describe the Ninoy Aquino book as a prequel to the our book, no, which appeared 37 years before. I'm reminded of, cinematic universes. But I do have a question. What does it mean for us and for our country if we end up thinking of the Ninoy Aquino timeline as an alternative universe, as one
Wow.
universe? We are in the middle of the Marcos restoration. I'm not sure exactly how invested President Marcos Jr. himself is, but I am 100% sure that Amy Marcos wants to rehabilitate her father to the maximum. Um, what if that succeeds? But because we are forgetful and forgiving people, we'll have those universes existing side by side. I mean, you look at the SWS survey, people still consider Ninoy Aquino a hero, and voted for overwhelmingly for Marcos Jr. So my question is, what does it mean for us in the project of building a nation? When history might be reduced to, well, just choose which cinematic universe you want to be part of. Can I start with Joanne and then Anne and end with Mookie?
I think in the end, in this battle, what's changed is in the 70s, there was a grassroots movement, very strong, that was politically grounded. Now, there are no really strong political orgs, maybe religious groups, yes, but there are none. So it's like we're beginning the work again. So doesn't matter, bring it on. Uh, Throw us anything, we will be there as long as we breathe and give it our best shot. So this effort um, to make a living thing out of Ninoy, I think it just has to go on and on. It has to be, it's a ballast, and it has to have its support. You just don't stop.
Thank you, Joanne. Anne?
Oh, my answer is I don't know what it will be like, but I do know that it's already happening. That we all are living in silos already. The fragmented media. We can choose now what news to watch. I have to be honest. I really choose. I don't watch
Yeah.
BBM speeches, so it's already happening.
Yeah.
Um, but like Joanne said, I have to keep trying to tell the truth from my perspective. I can't give up. And it's a matter of faith. It's a matter of survival. It's a matter of staying true. It's like if the 1983 assassination was erased, it's not just about Ninoy, but it's about me as well, who experienced such a great transformation at that period. And I have to stand up for what that is. And it's not just politics. It's faith. It's the ability to discern things. It's ability to stand up for something that was formed in that period. So I have to keep pushing that, keep drawing the line there.
Thank you, Anne. And Mookie?
I think, John, when you mention, alternate universes, what we want to do is really in keeping with what Anne and Ma'am Joanne said, is really to just empower the viewer and allow the viewer also to tell his own truth and to decide actually what truth he believes in, not to dictate, but to give a conversation, to start a conversation, to start a dialogue. And when we tell our own stories, we're not just passive viewers anymore. We're actually active in telling and in telling the narrative, and that's really what we can do, tell our truths. I mean, I wasn't there at that time, but coming across the material, I mean, it's good to have the viewpoint of somebody who just came across this material fresh, I think, and to hope that people from my generation and the next generations after will also, talk about how this affected them, how this affected their parents, how and tell the stories of, that day through the lens of, let's say, their parents or their older siblings. But I think that, yeah, we do have a responsibility to tell our own truths. Even people who didn't think that they had a voice, or people who think that they were not empowered to have their own version of the story, should be empowered to come out and break the silence and speak their own truths.
Thank you, Mookie. Thank you, Anne Mercado Alcantara, Mookie Katigbak-Lacuesta, and the legendary Joanne Maglipon. What an enlightening conversation. It reinforces our belief that one way to fight disinformation is to strengthen, to add to the historical record. In Rizal's words, to increase our heritage. That way, we can help create a robust public square. Again, many thanks to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you too.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's it for us tonight. But for a country still struggling with its history, the work never ends. As always, the next step for engaged citizens is to take a more active part in rebuilding our democracy. See you in the public square. This is John Nery. Thank you and good night.